Hello and welcome to the 5th edition of Impact Matters, a monthly webcast with cutting-edge thinkers and change agents on the topic of impact. I'm Amy Hall, founder and president of Impactorum, a coaching and advisory service for sustainability and CSR professionals. I'm also the vice president of social consciousness at Eileen Fisher. And with me is Anela Doisich, who's helping to facilitate this webcast.
Hi everyone, I'm Anela, and as always, I am here behind the scenes helping manage the logistics and the Q&A process for today. So before we get started, I wanted to share a couple of things. Along the bottom of your screen, you should see both a chat and a Q&A function. If you do want to ask a question at any point, just do so through the Q&A. And we're going to hold about the last 15 minutes of the call to answer as many questions as we can live. Otherwise, feel free to use the chat throughout the session. If you want to connect or discuss with anyone else that is on the webinar. Just a very important note about the chat function. Right now, the default setting is set to send your messages to all panelists only. So you're going to actually manually have to change that. So it says all panelists and attendees. When you open up your chat box, if you look just above, you'll see you have the option to toggle, select all panelists and attendees, and that will make sure your message is visible to everyone that's on the call. Okay, that's it for me, and I will catch up with you guys later on in the Q&A.
All right, thanks so much, Anela. And now I'd like to introduce today's guest. I've known Sara Schley for about 8 years now, though I first met her when I attended a sustainability consortium that she was facilitating almost 15 years ago. We reconnected when Eileen Fisher started down a new sustainability path, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Sara is a force for change. She has worked with hundreds of leaders over the last 2 or 3 decades, all in service of creating a better world where all life thrives. She has consulted for Nike, Ben & Jerry's, MIT, the World Wildlife Fund, Seventh Generation, Ford, and many more. Her business, Seed Systems, is a fellow B Corporation, and she is co-founder of WeTheChange, which brings women CEOs of B corporations and triple bottom line businesses together to create a radically inclusive and richly regenerative global economy. We'll be placing links to these and other references in the chat box throughout the webcast. And I could go on, but I really want you to meet Sara and let her tell her own story. And here we go. See if we can get Sara's video up. Sara, can you start your video?
Yes, I did.
There we are. Yay. Welcome, Sara, to Impact Matters.
Hi, it's such a pleasure, always such a privilege and a pleasure to spend time with you. And I'm really grateful to have the opportunity to join your hour this afternoon.
Well, it's super exciting. And because we know each other so well, I think this is going to be a really fun conversation. I mentioned at the top that you and I have known each other for about 8 years. And the focus of our conversation today is on the first 2 years of our friendship and our connection. So if you don't mind taking us back a bit more, perhaps you could give the audience a sense of who you are and how you approach your work.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think you said it beautifully in the introduction. I appreciated it. More recently, I've been saying creating a regenerative, inclusive, and kind world from the inside out. Those are my recent adjectives. But really for about 30 years, stop counting. I've been doing that work with Seed Systems, which is about sustainability, now regenerativity from the inside out. So that means, you could say me, we, world, or you could say coaching, consulting, and convening. Really, it's kind of like those concentric circles, starting with our own, centering, inspiration, focus, and then moving out from there in ripples.
Cool. Perfect. Thank you so much. And so to give a little context about our conversation, I think I'm going to do a little more talking in the beginning here than I usually do for these webcasts, just to set a tone of where we started. So we're talking about Eileen Fisher up to about the year 2012. So we were founded in 1984, and I joined the company in 93. And between 93 and 2012, we were committed to natural fibers, and we were dabbling in certain fun, sustainable fibers here and there. We had started our human rights work. Most of this work, I had a small team. Most of this work was, I would say, project-based. It was whenever we could make it happen. You know, my team might nudge a little bit, or there might be somebody in the company who wanted to try something. There was never, up to that point, a holistic kind of strategic approach set by the senior leaders of the company. So in a certain way, the social consciousness team that I had led and still do was a bit kind of on the side, and everybody was doing their work. You know, the design team was doing their work, supply chain team, etc. We weren't measuring much. We had started a little bit of carbon metrics up to that point, but really that was it. So we had no targets, we had no annual measures, and there we were. And then Eileen went on a kind of now almost legendary supply chain trip to Asia. And while she was there, she learned an awful lot about kind of the challenges that some of our suppliers in China in particular were facing at the time. And one of the issues that came up, it became really front and center in her consciousness, was the global water crisis. And she realized that water, you know, the kind of lack of water that was already very pronounced around the world was not just a humanitarian issue, but it was actually a business issue. If there wasn't enough water to irrigate the fields where the crops were grown, to provide fibers for our materials, that became a real business challenge. And in her head, if we didn't do something about it early and soon, we might not be able to proceed with business as usual going forward. So Eileen came back from this trip all fired up, and she went to a colleague of mine who was a senior leader in the company. Her name is Candace, and she asked Candace to partner with me to find a new way to kind of reignite energy around sustainability in the company in a way that we hadn't done before. As the leader of the team that had been largely responsible for sustainability up to that point, there was a little bit of a kind of sadness that, gosh, maybe what we had been doing up to that point wasn't good enough. But at the same time, I was super excited to have Eileen's kind of sanction and blessing to move this forward, as well as Candace's partnership, because it needed real senior leadership energy to make a new difference. So we move forward with that in mind. And I reached out. At that same moment, I happened to receive an email from Sara Schley, and I hadn't heard from Sara. I mean, literally hadn't even thought about her. Sorry, Sara, for years. But it was an invitation. She had sent it out to some, you know, prior colleagues of hers to this offsite that she was organizing called Leading from the Inside Out. And that's where the story begins. So Sara, I just wonder, you know, when you first heard from me, did you hear, you know, what were you thinking? This was Eileen Fisher reaching out, possibly wanting to get involved in your offsite or something else. Do you remember how you felt at that time?
Well, what I recall, Amy, was that we had one prior conversation about four or so years earlier, and I was very impressed with you. It was on the phone, so we hadn't met yet, but I had met Eileen at a Women and Power conference in New York City, and I remember falling in love. Now, 20 years earlier, my mom sent me Eileen Fisher outfit when I just got out of college, saying, you need to be wearing something different, you know, if you're going to get a job. So I used to call myself, before I even knew you all, the poster child for Eileen Fisher, because I wore Eileen as my, you know, sort of professional uniform. But then when I met her, and I was, as so many people are, just struck by her kind of unique, humble, aspirational, generous way. I remember she had brought young women from overseas to this conference who were inspired to go. And so it just struck me that Eileen Fisher was a wonderful company. And then having had that conversation with you, but at the time you told me, now this is before the incident that you said around Eileen going to China, it was around 2008. And you said, well, we're not quite ready on the environmental side yet. We're doing work on the social side. But so I had that sort of ... hoping someday you all would be. And then when you contacted me for that leading from the inside out, I thought, okay, now it's time to, pursue Eileen Fisher. I hope that they're ready. So I think I was just excited, having met you by phone, having met Eileen, peripherally in the audience. I think I asked her a question that Eileen Fisher might be open to doing this work now in a more comprehensive way.
Thank you. And so I didn't actually go to that offsite leading from the inside out, right? But we did invite you to come play with us for a day. We invited you to have lunch with senior leaders in the company and just kind of do a kind of mutual feel out and see if this felt like a good fit. And then it led to, you brought an opportunity to us, which was called Launch. You had been somehow involved with Launch. Do you want to tell a little bit about what Launch is?
Sure. Well, as you mentioned on the front of the hour, Amy, I had been working with Nike for several years at that point, and they invited me to come to Launch, which was a partnership between some very unlikely bedfellows, Nike, USAID, and the UN, I believe, and there was one other partner.
NASA.
NASA, exactly. That's who it was. Thank you. The goal that year was to do transformational work around apparel because they realized that apparel was one of the biggest causes for pollution and carbon footprint and basically devastation of ecosystems on the planet. And so they have the Launch is a challenge, a creativity challenge. They invited people from all walks to that. And because I just met you, I think I called up Candace, who happens to be in my neighborhood here in Western Mass by bizarre coincidence, and said, hey, do you want to go? And she was like, great. So thus we got involved at Launch. You, Amy, and Candace decided to what were they called? An application or submit a challenge idea, and you won. Right?
Well, we were one of the 10 winners, so we weren't the only winner. Yeah. And it was called Blue Flower, and that could be a topic for a whole webinar all by itself. But suffice it to say, it was a very visionary concept that was in a way circular. It really held on to the full life cycle of the product, including sourcing the material creation, the labor involved in the manufacture of the product, education, training, preparing women for other kinds of work, all locally done within the New York area. So it was very local, it was very holistic. And we were really excited and pumped up about this idea, and we worked for months afterwards to try to get something off the ground, and it never really took off. And I think one of the big learnings was we hadn't properly seeded it and gained buy-in across, multiple teams, particularly at the senior leadership level of the company. And, we really kind of just took it a little far, but it was off to the side. And so we were lacking what we later learned from Sara was the system in the room. And so it kind of became dormant, that concept, although we had a lot of energy for it at the time. And then we came back to, okay, what do we really need to do to push this broad concept of sustainability forward in the company? And you then came to us with a new idea.
Yeah. Well, after I was involved with Blue Flower in the Launch to the extent that I remember you and Candace invited me to a World Cafe, which is a brainstorming event on campus in Manhattan at your 111 headquarters, 111 Fifth Street, I think it is. Mm-hmm. And what I noticed from that was, tremendous energy, brilliance, beauty, as you can imagine, almost all women in the room, very unusual, exciting. But this kind of, as you said, project focus in my mind from a system standpoint, which I forgot to say, that's part of my background, systems thinking, we would call that fragmented as opposed to kind of comprehensive and systemic. So like you said, you have different designs over here doing their thing, manufacturing's over here doing their thing. And what we need is, we can't solve complex problems in isolation. So we need the whole system in the room to be able to tell a comprehensive story that identifies what this problem really is, and then be able to solve it from there. So kind of the classic metaphor we use is, I believe it's a Sufi story of the blind man on the elephant, with all respect to blind people, but it's a story. And you see the elephant. If I had a cartoon, I'd put it up now. And one blind person, he's got a leg, and he says, an elephant's like a trunk. And then somebody else has an ear, and he says, an elephant's like a fuzzy thing. And somebody else has the tail, and he says, an elephant's long and skinny. And it goes on like that. And the question is, who's right? And the answer is, of course, none of them alone, but we need all of them together to understand the complete elephant. So what we want, you could say the elephant is sort of an interesting metaphor, but we want to get the elephant in the room. That's a different thing. So we started to think about that. And you and Candace were great around, okay, let's get visionary, let's get aspirational. And part of my training is sort of reach for the stars, audacious. I don't know if people can see me, but we used to have this metaphor, the rubber band, that comes from a guy called Robert Fritz, which is creative tension. Do you have a rubber band, Amy?
I'm looking for one. Here we go.
And so creative tension says that the more that if the rubber band, if my fingers are close together, how much energy is in that system? Not much. As I move my fingers further and further apart, there's more and more energy in the system to propel my current reality, which is Amy's bottom finger, towards my aspirational vision. So we always say, go for the gold, dream big. It's better to get 10% of 100 than 100% of 2. Okay. So anyway, to achieve that aspirational vision of, at this point, I think Eileen was saying, we want to be a 100% sustainable company. And people were saying, what does that mean? Okay, well, we have to get everyone in the room. And you and Candace, we decided that the biggest bang for the buck, so to speak, the place to start was with product. How do we design, develop, manufacture, distribute, and bring the product back? And we started off over time calling that from concept to closet and back again, that would be the whole system. So I asked you, as an outsider, which I am, into your system, and you're the expert in apparel, who do we need in the room? So you guys started brainstorming. Okay, we need our designers, we need our manufacturers, we need our business planning people, we need some senior executives, we need, of course, social consciousness. Who else did we need? Who am I leaving out?
We had folks from merchandising. I think you said business planning, right? I think the one that we were missing, we could, because of scheduling difficulties, we couldn't get anybody from sales, which might have been an important component at that time, but we got them later.
Yeah, we got them later.
Consciousness, and Eileen's team, because Eileen being the kind of, visionary leader of the company.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think there were about 22 of us altogether, something like that.
Yeah, and I had said at that time, life is different on Zoom now, but at that time, to have a small enough group to be effective, but a comprehensive enough group to represent the system, 20 or so would be good. So that's what we did. And we had this offsite back in the day when we could, at this beautiful place called Wandharma, which of all things was a Buddhist retreat center by Samsung, the Japanese company, in the Catskill Mountains. And everyone showed up. These people that we just mentioned. There was Jackie from design, and Liz from manufacturing, and Regina from business planning, and many other people. In addition, who came but Eileen? And Eileen was going to come for 2 hours. This offsite was 4 days, and she stayed for all 4 days. So that was quite a statement in itself, because obviously a lot of people out there in business know a lot of times the CEO comes and just sort of like gives an effort like this, its blessing, and then goes off. But the fact that she demonstrated her commitment by staying for all 4 days was quite impressive. And at one point, I can't remember, because she has been interviewed on podcasts like this, and she talks about at one point, she turned to me and said something like, this is going to change everything. And then I said, something like, can you tell everybody that? And she made a statement to the room saying, we're committed. And that made a huge difference.
So what happened was, we got everybody there, and everybody was kind of like, what's going to happen? I'm not sure if I should be here. It was a little like we were literally out in the middle of nowhere. But also it was vegetarian, and there was no liquor. So it was very controversial. But Sarah, we were each handed, I just found mine yesterday looking through my desk. We were each handed these little notebooks, and we were each sent out into the woods. Sarah carefully planted us like very far apart from each other, so we couldn't see each other, way out in the middle of the woods. And we were told to sit there for an hour and just journal about what we were sensing, our hearing, smelling, seeing, feeling, and or thinking about whatever came up. And we just wrote and wrote and wrote. And there was people afterwards, when we all convened after that, who said, gosh, that made me really nervous. I'd never spent an hour in the woods before. And the whole purpose of this was to get each of us to connect with the earth in hopefully a way that we hadn't done before. And that was very evident from the reactions we were getting. And from that, then build out into, you know, what's our vision for ourselves and our families? What's our vision for the world? And then how does our company relate to that? How can we as a company together, each of us members of this company, build a shared vision for the impact that we want to make as a company on the planet? And it was so powerful. And that's how we spent the next 3.5 days after that, is building that vision.
A story I love to tell from there that I remember, one of the women who was, Manhattan, and I think had never spent an hour in the woods by herself, maybe not an hour alone without electronics for a while. And I think she was pregnant at the time, had one kid at home. She was very resistant, but she was brave and she went. And when she came back, we had people share their stories if they were willing. And she was just laughing. She said, I sat there by a tree being annoyed. And sure enough, an acorn fell right on my head, like Newton. And I thought, this is literally a wake-up call. And then, she kind of, with humor, got into the whole program from there. And I do think, people are sort of resistant or maybe skeptical. Why do we need to go out in the woods? Well, just like Amy said, there's a way that we wanted to have people reconnect with nature. I think one of the questions what I asked was, recall a time when you felt connected with nature as a child, and what was that like? And sort of feel that viscerally, to then go from there to our aspirational vision at the top of the rubber band. Okay, I want to take that commitment to my company where I have my domain of contribution, and let's be inspired from there.
So, this story actually takes us all the way to present day, but we're not going to get there today because there's so much to share. And I think we're probably mostly going to talk about One Dharma, and then a little bit about what happened afterwards and how One Dharma set us up for the next 5 years of work that we did together as a kind of united cross-functional team. But one of the things we did, and I found this in my notebook, was we each had to journal about what our vision was. And I thought I might just read a couple sentences of mine. And then I have notes from somebody else's vision. And I thought I might share that because it's really interesting to note that going back to that rubber band, our vision, our aspirations were really high at the time. And you know what? We had to kind of also then embed it in reality. Like, what could we actually achieve? But we were asked to think about by 2020. So this already was the year 2013 when we were doing this offsite. So my vision was, by 2020, not a single piece of Eileen Fisher clothing is made with environmentally impactful fabrics in factories that pay less than a living wage. So nothing is made in factories that pay less than a living wage. Our fabrics are closed loop, if possible, or organic, with dyes and finishes that nourish the earth. Our factory workers have opportunities for growth and development. They love their work and the product they make. And we are one of several like-minded brands that share this vision, these values. And I could go on. And another person wrote, I've just made notes that she was envisioned biodegradable stretch fiber compostable fabrics, fibers that haven't been invented yet. Supply chain partners are fully participatory in the sustainability workshops like this. So you can see the inspiration that happened for us, the little sparks that were lit, I think, by your work, Sara, and your prompts. And I think that was really where this all started.
So awesome. That's like the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's like finding, the original source material. It's wonderful to hear that 7 years later, because I think, there was progress made in all of those domains, a lot of progress. And particularly, you know better than I do, but in terms of numbers, but around organic cotton, organic linen, blue sign silk, and also the big deal, I think, was viscose was kind of the holy grail of this product that was one of Eileen Fisher's biggest sellers, but was not great for the environment, and finding alternatives to that in the last 7 years, which is pretty awesome. And Tencel. And
yeah.
yeah.
And so you helped us build a skill, a muscle around system mapping. And I have to say it was both mind-blowing and mind-opening and really hard. System mapping is really hard, and it makes a lot of sense when you actually learn how to do it. But what that enabled us to do, it takes the emotion and the individual responsibility out of it. It takes the blame out of any process. You can't look at it and say, oh, that's your responsibility, I don't have anything to do with it. Because what you're realizing is we all have to hold hands around this, whatever this process is that we're talking about. And it's each of our responsibility at some point along the way to keep this process moving forward. It was super powerful, and it became the launching pad for a lot of the initiatives that we started following this offsite.
That's great to hear. Well, we did, I mean, so in addition to having the system in the room, the physical people, those physical people together have the whole elephant, so to speak, to go back to the last metaphor. And so together they can draw the system of concept to closet that, like, you alone, Amy, couldn't draw. I couldn't draw alone. The president of manufacturing, vice president of manufacturing couldn't draw alone, but together we can map that system. So there is a little bit of mapping teaching, but when you think about it, I think we had like a 3 or 4 hour training, and then you guys were off to the races to understand the system. And the idea of that is to find the points of highest leverage, where if we, switch metaphors, biggest bang for the buck. If we press here in the system, we'll get the most reward. We'll move the farthest as a result of that action. So I think a good example that I often like to tell, because it was an aha for me in the moment, was take your phenomenal, amazing, and wonderful and brilliant colleague, Shona Quinn, who was head of environmental sustainability, and I think still is. And for in any company, like you were saying, Amy, because I've worked in a lot of businesses by now, the analog to you guys of social consciousness, or someplace else it might be called social responsibility, or someplace else it might be called the environmental team, if you're at Nike or Ford or Harley or you name it, they're going to be pretty isolated, right? And it's hard to have leverage. It's hard to have an impact if you're over here working and saying, hey guys, change the light bulbs. Or even if you have a bigger idea, like, hey guys, I'll tell you in a minute what the idea is. I don't want to say it yet. So Shona had, tons of ideas about how to do this, but really it's important for the people who are on the leading edge, or out there in the work in manufacturing and design, to get it themselves, own it themselves, understand it themselves, draw it themselves together, become passionately connected. So Shona may have a vision around decreasing carbon footprint, and somebody might think, oh, okay, yeah, we need to change the light bulbs in facilities. And that's a good thing to do. But when you do the whole systems analysis for apparel in the company business you guys are working in, where a lot of stuff is manufactured overseas, what's the biggest impact, it turns out, when you do that assessment of carbon footprint? Where do you get the biggest carbon footprint? If I was in a room with you all listening, I'd say, anybody have a guess? And you can put some guesses in the chat if you want, or if you're in apparel, you might know. I didn't know till I was in that room those 3 days. Well, it turns out, drum roll, the biggest impact is sending product by air instead of sending product by sea, right? Air shipments instead of sea shipments. Of course, you're using way more carbon. Why do you have to send stuff by air instead of sea if you're committed to lowering your carbon footprint? Well, of course, I guess we needed to do it right now because we want to get to the customer. So all of a sudden, instead of this being Shona's problem, once people identified that high leverage point of moving from air shipments to sea shipments, now Liz, who's in charge of manufacturing, and Regina, who's in charge of business planning, merchandising, and Jackie on design, they're part of that whole system, because they have to figure out, okay, how do we do this differently? How do we commit to product differently or sooner? How do we talk to our big accounts like Nordstrom's differently? How do we get them bought in? And now all of a sudden, these leaders in the company at the highest level are bought in. And now Shona and Amy have a whole ton of leverage that they didn't have before.
And what we also realized by doing that exact map that Sarah just described around lowering our carbon footprint, we also realized that not only does the air shipment model really boost our carbon footprint, but it also increases the stress on the suppliers so that the working hours were much higher than they should have been. And the wages were probably not paid at the rate they should have been, because they were so stressed for time at the very end. And we had agreed on a rate prior to that. They just had what they had to pay the workers, and they didn't want to tell us, so there wasn't any transparency. It was all hidden from us. They didn't want to lose the business. So we uncovered a lot of this. We realized that carbon footprint is directly related to worker well-being, and by way of all of our internal business processes, which was a shocking revelation. And it then tumbled into what has now been a 4 or 5 year project inside the company, or an initiative, I would say, to improve the efficiency of our internal processes, increase the time given to suppliers so that more product can be shipped by sea. And we're still not.
So if you can imagine what Amy's saying right there, if we're in the room together drawing this map, the merchandising and account people and salespeople might see, or environmental people might see the environmental impact, but you have social conscious leads like Luna in the room, and she's also going to see the social impact that Amy just mentioned. So I was parenthetically, Amy and I are working on an article I hope you'll read. It's way too long right now, but it's about this very story. And I have my brilliant child editor, who's 18 and just kicks my butt in my writing, edit this thing. And just before we got on, I said, Maya, what should we make sure that we share with people? And she said, tell them about Audacious Vision, but also tell them about the riverbanks. So would this be a good time to talk about that?
It's an excellent segue into the riverbanks.
Okay.
I was noting in my little notebook here that I had, where I'd kept my notes, some of the to-dos that we gave ourselves by the end of the 4-day period. And one of them, there are many, every single person left with a series of XYZs, which is our to-dos. And one of them was specifically for social consciousness to work with our design team to help them determine what the goals should be, so that they could move from wherever they were now on each of their fibers to 100% of something, whether it's 100% organic, 100% recycled chemistry, which was moving from viscose to tencel, et cetera. And that was a major breakthrough, because we had never really collaborated with design or with anybody really on setting goals, sustainability goals, but they expressed the need and we said absolutely. And of course it took us another year or two almost to really nail those goals down, because it was such an iterative process, and we wanted to make sure that the goals were realistic with a little bit of stretch in there, and as well as being kind of ambitious, but also recognizing that we're making our own goals. And if we create the goal, it's okay in some cases if we don't quite get there, and we didn't get there in every case. But it really propelled us forward, because everybody then had their marching orders, and they were part of creating them, and they embraced them, and there wasn't much pushback at all.
Beautiful. So I'll bring us back a minute before the offsite, which is I do interviews with everybody who's going to be there. And one of the people, and she said I could share this in the article, so I imagine I can share it here, was Jackie Hoffman, a wonderful lead designer at Eileen Fisher. And I had shared with Jackie the story of Darcy Winslow, who was head of Nike Women's Worldwide and sustainability and a bunch of other titles, good friend now. And this story goes back another 10 years when she was lead of sustainability, Eileen Fisher at Nike. And she set these crazy stretch goals of 0 to landfill, 0 toxins, 100% remanufacturable, 100% closed loops, and then said to the designers, ready, set, go. So previously they just had the typical design constraints of aesthetics, performance, and cost. And now they just added those other constraints. And as just do it competitive folks, they're like, okay, we can do that. So in the interview, I mentioned to Jackie, because I think she had said, we don't have enough direction from the top. We don't have enough clarity. Is this good enough? Is this not good enough? I mentioned the Darcy story. I said, would that be helpful, Jackie? And she said, oh, that'd be amazing. So with that sort of spirit going into the offsite, we came up with what the the phrase that we used to describe these stretch goals, but also strong constraints, were riverbanks. And the idea is, the metaphor is at the riverbank, the strong constraints is those, steady banks, zero to landfills, zero talk-ins, whatever we're not doing. And then those steady banks allow the river to flow towards what we aspire to. So it's both constraints and aspiration, the riverbanks. And then the team there came up with riverbanks in 8 areas, 4 in environmental and 4 in social. And that's what Amy's saying. Then they refined over the next couple of years, but we did get right on it like 2 months later. We had a follow-up offsite, actually at my place in Western Mass. And the folks there got very specific about, okay, we want to do materials, chemistry, water, carbon on the environmental side. We're going to do worker happiness, fair wage, worker voice, and conscious business practices. Did I get those all right, Amy?
Yes.
On the social side. And then ready, set, go. Let's go to work on making those, making them specific, 100% or 80% or whatever that's going to be. So those are the riverbanks. And I think I just mentioned that because in addition to having aspirational goals, we need to be specific about them, give people direction. It really helps make it happen.
Yeah. And so what happened was we finished the offsite, we went back, we worked on the riverbanks, and then the work has to happen, like to actually make the work make the riverbanks achievable. So those big teams that were involved in the offsite each formed their own sort of working groups, each addressing aspects of this work. So for example, under manufacturing, we had at the time, and some of these lasted and some, didn't last quite as long. We had working groups around company shipping, cost evaluation, factory standards, New York local factories. We also had, under the commits process, we created what ended up becoming called a product lifecycle initiative. And under design, I remember we had a wool working group, we had chemistry working group, we had a metrics working group, multiple working groups that each owned elements of this work, so to keep it manageable and to engage even more people. So, there was the core group that went to the offsite, and then out of that, there were more people, like sort of the middle management, if you will, level of people who were involved in actually making this stuff happen. It was very, very empowering. And we established to really guide this work going forward. It then moved completely out of my team. And we formed this thing called the Sustainability Design Team. And it was a good portion of the original group that went on the offsite, but not everybody. So we identified, I think it was maybe a dozen people who really kind of held hands. They were all from different teams for the most part. And we met once a month for a full day in person at our headquarters in Irvington, New York. And then every week for an hour by phone to really make sure that we were continuing to move the work forward, or to talk about challenges and questions that each of our groups might have been coming up with. And it became a real support group for each other, and really enabled us to embed this work really deeply. And I'd say that effort lasted a good 4 or 5 years. We finally kind of disbanded it maybe about 2 years ago, because the work was happening and we didn't need to keep coming in to check in on each other. And all of that was facilitated by Sara.
Yeah, it was quite amazing that, because we had, I was sort of just musing all of this from, sitting in the woods under an acorn tree and getting your head bopped by an acorn. People had made a personal commitment and a visceral commitment. And then through mapping the system that Amy mentioned, I'm not the cause of the problem, but together we can solve the problem. You're not, I'm not going to point a finger at you, together. So I think people got that. So then once they were committed to these aspirational goals, they're also committed to the design team that had, again, concept to closet, manufacturing, design, business planning, social consciousness, senior leadership. And so that was pretty awesome that people kept a day a month for that and an hour a week for quite some time. And that, Amy and her team supported it. Eileen supported it, because they were making really progress. They were really making stuff happen. And I think the one other thing I wanted to mention, you mentioned briefly the XYZs, Amy. But there's, you know, people say, oh, you went to the woods, you know, you're out, you're dreaming, you have these aspirational goals, you're in a Buddhist center. Yeah, but then we like take names and numbers, right? So it's both aspirational vision and then very practical, where at the end of every meeting, we do the XYZs. And what's that? It's a simple but deceptively simple form of accountability, which is we're going to do thing X by person Y by time Z. And you have to have all three of those. If you have X and Y without the time, if you have what we're doing without the person, right? So, you know, we need to call up this Nordstrom's to get them on board. Okay, great. Who's doing it? By when? And what's the specific action? Who are you calling? And then, so we make a flip chart list every single meeting. And then people will be kind of like, oh God, do I have to? But they really followed through. And that's what made this thing both, you know, be visionary, but also very practical and very effective, I think. Good job, team.
And we still use XYZs in our, you know, here and there, not throughout the whole company all the time, but they still show up. And, you know, some of us still do system mapping. I mean, it just depends. You know, we've all kind of picked different skills and tools from your work as needed. And now we are, so we, you know, all of that rolled into what became our Vision 2020 goals. We graduated those at the beginning of this year, being 2020, and now we're trying to kind of get our arms around our new goals, which we're calling Horizon 2030. Everything has gone kaflooey because of the pandemic, so we're in a different place. All kinds of things are different, but I imagine that we're going to be incorporating a lot of the elements of what you taught us to get this work off the ground as well. I think it's also worth noting that, you know, there was a lot of interest in the company around how can other people, like a lot of people were kind of looking from the outside at this sustainability design group and some of these working groups and feeling like they were feeling a little left out. How can I get involved? So somebody on my team then created became a two-year initiative called the Sustainability Ambassadors Program. So she and fellow colleagues in the company developed a curriculum that was based on the product life cycle. And they basically selected, you had to apply for it, from selected folks from all around the company, including people in our stores, to go through this curriculum. It was within 1 year. So there were 2 cycles, 1 year each, to go through this curriculum, learn both the environmental and human impacts of the work that we do as a company, and then bring it home. How can they as an individual make a difference? What is meaningful to them, and what can they do from their standpoint inside the company? And they would create a project around that. And we ran that program for 2 years. Again, we had to move on. It got very time, labor intensive for us to keep it up. But the idea was that there's a real thirst for this. People want to be engaged. They want to find different ways to bring this work into their own kind of personal place. So it really all goes back to one Dharma and lighting that fire underneath us. And you know, now also during that time, we became a certified B Corporation, and you know, some of the same principles still apply. How do we push this out into the company and not just wholly own it within like one team? So, you know, I would say that's the main guts of the story. Is there anything else you'd want to add to that, Sarah?
Can I just say real briefly about WeTheChange?
Sure.
Because that also
Yes,
was born from this partnership.
Yeah.
Because I think there was just like a spirit of aspirational and inspirational. And Eileen, at one point was Eileen Fisher became a B Corp over this time, as Amy said, shepherded by Rebecca McGee, who was also awesome on our team. And it was also one of the creators of the Sustainability Ambassadors. But at any rate, so at one point, one of my friends and colleagues for many years who works at B Lab said, you know, would Eileen like to convene something around apparel? And I talked for other CEOs. And Amy said, you know, there's not that many apparel companies and B Corps that are big enough for us to make it really interesting. but Eileen was very passionate about women's leadership. So I said, well, what if we convened all the women B Corp CEOs, the women CEOs of all the B Corps, and bring them to Eileen Fisher. And Eileen's a woman B Corp CEO, Rose Mercario at the time of Patagonia. And, we'll launch a similar kind of aspirational thing around our vision for women in the room. And so Eileen did that. And we hosted the first one with about 90 women B Corp CEOs in 2018. And now that's grown into a movement of its own called WeTheChange. Check it out, WeTheChange.net, which is women leading business for good. Women and all allies, women leading business for good plus allies who want to support us. So that was another thing that was born out of this whole effort, and that just ripples right now, which is wonderful.
Yeah, it's super exciting, super exciting.
Yeah, thanks to this effort. So
I just want to remind you, everybody who's listening, if you have any questions, throw it in the chat box, the Q&A box, and we will keep talking for a few more minutes, and then we'll look and see what's in there. Sara, if you think about people who are listening here, what's, to make it personal to them, what's one thing that you think they could keep in mind if they want to shift their company or their workplace to a more sustainable path? Does anything come to mind for you?
Wow, it's a great question. I have to say, when we talked about leading from the inside out right now with the COVID reality, I feel like first thing is make sure you're taking care of yourself, because sustainability is from the inside out. So hard it is as it is, whatever practices you do to stay centered and calm and focused and capable, and maybe even with some humor in these wild and crazy times, make sure you're doing that. Amy's really good at showing up that way. And then from there to engage other colleagues. I mean, I almost would put that question back to you, Amy, because I'm going to put that question back to you.
Well, luckily I have
do?
an answer. I was thinking about this because, of course, I wrote the question. When I think about sustainability, my personal pet peeve about sustainability is when a company either focuses entirely on philanthropy, for example, the buy one, give one model, and thinks that because they're doing that, they are fully, responsible, and they're ignoring their own operations. So while that's good, it isn't the whole picture, right? So, and my second pet peeve is when a company literally takes the kind of low hanging fruit right off the bat, and then markets it all over the place and says, we're doing everything we can, which is typically packaging or, something that, again, is ignoring the central focus of what they're doing. And so my point here is, I think sustainability always starts with the product and the supply chain. That's how we thought about it. We went right into, actually prior to engaging with you, we hired somebody to conduct a product lifecycle assessment of our top 5 highest volume fabrics. And that enabled us to kind of understand, which ones were the biggest water users, which ones were the biggest resource users in general. And it allowed us to rank them in terms of, biggest impact to narrowest impact. So we started with cotton, and we started to make some things out of organic cotton as far back as 2004. But it was a place to start. We recognized that we couldn't do everything all at once. We still can't. And we were, so it got us on the path. It allowed us to feel good about what we were doing. Mm-hmm. And then, when we started working with you, that really allowed us to ramp up and kind of pull out the big guns. So go deep, start with the product.
Nice. And then I would build on that. Totally agree. And just say, I think having your own aspirational vision is great because that can be infectious. What do you want to create? And then go and find partners, go and find allies, because now we know from the system, none of us can do this alone. We don't, by definition, we don't understand the whole of it. So find people in different parts of the company. If you're in social consciousness or social responsibility, find people who are, connected to where the product is most, has the most cachet and impact in the business. So again, going back to Nike, they'd say product is king, and of the product that was king, footwear was king. So go find somebody in footwear, and get them excited, or find, basically you're going to need to build that coalition. Of course, you got to get senior leadership involved too. But anyway,
yeah, got to get the system in the room. So Anela, I think we've got some questions, and we have just under 10 minutes left. So love to get a couple of those in the pipeline.
Yeah, and I think you guys have touched on a couple of them. There's one here asking, what new developments or innovations in sustainability are most exciting to you right now? And what are some issues in the field that you think should be getting more attention?
Wow, great question. Amy,
well, I'm always excited about things having to do with circularity. And I will say that circularity is more than just taking clothes back and making something new out of the old clothes, which is kind of where we are right now. But it's really thinking, well, full circle. How do you keep that going? And at some point, all of that stuff is going to go into the landfill. It's unlikely that we'll be able to keep the circular loop going on indefinitely. So we always have to think about compostability and, what's going to happen when that thing goes to the waste heap. Will it decompose and be at minimal, not harmful to the earth, but even better if it could actually nourish the earth? So those two aspects I think are really important.
And I would say, yes. And this term regenerative enterprise or regenerative agriculture, as opposed to just sustainable or organic. I know Patagonia and Dr. Bronner's are leading in that domain. I can't remember the name of the actual organization. Maybe you remember.
Well, we're involved in the Savory Institute, which is one of the regenerative ag organizations. Yeah, so I don't know if that's the one that you're thinking
of. Look up regenerative ag and Dr. Bronner's, you'll find it. But basically the notion is that, it's not enough to, for example, have organic cotton if you're, excuse the expression, screwing the workers. Or, it looks more holistically at the whole impact. Mm-hmm. And it wants to give back to the community as opposed to take from. Dear friend of ours here in Western Mass, Dean Sycon of Dean's Beans, his whole notion was business as a vehicle for people-centered change. So he's working in the coffee lands and only for the purpose of supporting and building the communities of farmers there, right? So it's beyond fair trade. But so it's, and his business is thriving. So it doesn't have to be either or. But I think that notion of regenerativity and giving back. Yeah. And what's not receiving enough attention, that's probably books. I still think the notion of exponential growth of profits is a problem. The multinational Wall Street-based concept of exponential growth of profits being the number one goal. So I think a really good movement there is Imperative 21, which J. Cohen Gilbert, who is the founder of B Corp, co-founder of B Corps, he's one of the guys behind that. We're really looking at what's a different model. And then I think, of course, the whole B Corporation movement, because it's companies that are inspiring each other to use business as a force for good and environmental and social, and also diversity, JEDI metrics, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. So I think all of those are exciting.
Anela, what else do we have?
We have a question here about, have you encountered reliable social impact measures worth sharing for people in the educational or cultural space? And then kind of a additional question here about measures on creativity, for example, or the impact of creativity on the design process. I think they're intended to be connected.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to say on measuring creativity. We did try to get an innovation effort off the ground a couple of years ago and got stymied with that. But in terms of social metrics in general, we have measured a few different things. One is at the factory level, whether a product comes from a certified factory, certified in fair trade or certified in SA 8000, whether the work itself is deemed to support worker well-being as voiced by the workers themselves through cell phone surveys and other ways of hearing from them, whether the suppliers themselves propagate these values to their own suppliers. So in other words, they become, the values themselves become a driving force in their relationships with their other suppliers, and whether a living wage is paid. And we've been, looking for all 4 of those to be fulfilled in order for a supplier to be deemed socially responsible. It's not a perfect set of metrics. We recognize that. We kind of feel like we've done the 1.0, 1.5 version. We really need to get better at that. At the company level, we have measured inclusion, and we've sent a survey out. We're going to be doing another one sort of the end of this year, beginning of next year, we hope to anyway, to measure people's sense of inclusion in the company, related to all kinds of things, tenure, age, race, ethnicity, gender, etc. And so none of those completely answer the questions, but those are the things that we have measured with some regularity, and I think they're promising. Anything else? I think we have time for one more question before we wrap up, if there is one more.
Yeah, so can you speak a little more about seeding and how to get buy-in across all departments?
What was the first word, Annella? Speak a little bit more about
seeding.
Seeding, like getting it out there?
Yeah.
I mean, I think you have to give them the experience. People have to be willing to take a leap that the folks that Amy invited to that offsite were willing to say, okay, I'm gonna give up some time. But I think in part it's helpful to have senior leadership say, it's a good idea to go, but then in order for them to have buy-in beyond that, to seed it beyond that, is to do those kinds of things that we talked about. System in the room, audacious vision, mapping the system, understanding where you are in it, understanding why what you are going to do makes a difference. It has a huge impact because you're connected to the highest points of leverage, air shipments, sea shipments. I think it's, for me, it's always been about giving people an experience, not just talking at them, helping to build the relationships between folks, because that's inspirational too. You're committed to a team, and then helping them articulate then through that experience, visceral experience, what this means to them, and then they're going to be bought in.
I call it the reality tour or reality experience. It really helps. That was Eileen's aha moment, and then we brought it back and we gave leaders a version of that by taking them out into the woods and also then holding hands around that system mapping and bringing it home and helping them realize their role in this. It was very effective. So I think we're going to have to wrap it up. Thank you so much, Sara, for your time and your wisdom, your humor. It is so valuable to me personally, and I think to everybody here. And I just want to put a plug in. If anyone here wants to find out more about you, your website is www.seedsystems.net, seedsystems.net. Thank you, Annella, for facilitating the questions and answers and the logistics. And my next webcast will be post-election, but not having anything to do with the election, on December 2nd for a conversation with Doreen Shanaz, who has pioneered a financial market tool that benefits the most vulnerable women and girls in South Asia. She's a fascinating woman, amazing story. You can find all of our conversations on the Impactorum YouTube channel or through the Impactorum website. Thank you, everybody, and Sara and Annella.
Thank you so much, Amy. This was wonderful. Appreciate you. Thank you.